Hello everyone, my name is Hannah Back and my presentation is going to be covering Operation Cowboy. This presentation was prepared for my History 216 class, Introduction to World War II, instructed by Professor George Maniatis. Introduction. In this presentation, we will learn about two enemies who united to save the world's most magnificent horses. This touching operation occurred toward the conclusion of World War II when the circumstances were still harsh, even though the defeat of Nazi Germany was only days away. Some people that we will meet throughout this presentation include Gustav Raoul, Dr. Rudolf Lessing, Alois Podhasky, Herbert Rudofsky, Colonel Hank Reed, General George S. Patton, Thomas Stewart, Ferdinand Spurl, Walter H., Wolfgang Kroll, General Schultz, Colonel Fred Hamilton, Donald Quinlivan, Bew Patton, and Earl Hurlburt. Places we will visit while learning about this operation will be Germany, Poland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. We will also visit America and learn about their journey through the Atlantic Ocean. In Germany, we will visit Kolsting and Bremerhaven. In Poland, Janau Podhasky. In Austria, Spanish Riding School and St. Martin. Czechoslovakia, Hostile Stud Farm. In America, we will learn about what they did in Newport News, Virginia, Panama Remount Depot in California, and Kellogg's Farm. When they travel through the Atlantic, they go through the Bay of Biscay, and we will also talk about that. So, how did we get here? The Nazis have proved to be a powerful nation throughout the years of World War II. Poland. In 1939, Germany signed the Ribbentrop-Molotov Non-Aggression Pact, which led to the two-sided invasion of Poland. Germany wanted to focus on repopulating their horses so they could replace the ones they had lost on the battlefield. Gustav Raoul will be the man appointed to oversee the horse breeding program. On to Austria. In 1938, Hitler pressured Austria to reunite with Germany, and this was known as Anschluss. Bombings are happening all over Austria, including Vienna, where the Spanish riding school is located. Alois Podhasky is in a tough situation, considering he is responsible for the school and all the valuable horses that live there. Finally, America. The 2nd Cavalry had the job of horses. They were to build up the unit. Their base was at Fort Riley in Kansas. At this point in the war, strategies were changing. Many men felt that it was time to ditch the horses and move on to machinery. The United States was focused on mass production to support the war taking place over in Europe. Here is a map of most of the villages, locations that I had listed in the introduction slide. In Poland, we see Janau Pulaski. In Germany, we see Bremerhaven. Monsbach, we will touch on a little bit. Kolsting. In the Sudetenland, we see Hostile is located. In Austria, we see Vienna and St. Martin listed on this map. Janau Podlaski. Janau Pulaski was located 435 miles east of the Berlin Army High Command, and they were clueless that their Arabian horses would be the first Gustav Raoul would claim. This was a beautiful stud farm located next to the Bug River that was established in 1817. On April 30th, 1938, a mare delivered a colt, and according to the people at the farm, one of the most promising fowls of the year. He also had a white star located on his forehead. They named him Watez, meaning warrior. The best stallion on the farm, the sire of Watez, also had 2 other colts, Stained Glass and Grand Slam. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the director of the riding school decided it was best to leave the farm. They evacuated across the Bug River with 250 horses only traveling at night because the Germans were attacking civilians. They came across a Polish military convoy blocking the road, and the horse panicked. 80 horses were lost in the woods and had to continue. Horses were tired and tender hoofs. Once again, they encountered problems when the horses got tangled in barbed wire and they had to euthanize them. It took 3 days to make it to the bridge that crossed the Bug River. When they finally crossed it, they knew something was wrong. Kaval, the small city, was on fire. They had to turn around and head back home, but when they returned to the bridge, it was destroyed. They had to head south and take another route. When they arrived back at the farm, they realized it was under German occupation, and a few short days later, they would seize the horses and take them east. Gustave Raoult, the Great Improver. Gustave Raoult arrived at the stud farm and soon started to restore it. He set out to find all the horses that were lost along the route to the Bug River, who could have been hidden by locals or still wandering in the woods alone. Raoult was a German hippologist. Hippology is a field that focuses on the anatomy, behavior, and care of horses. Olympic organizer and loved fine horses. Wittes and his brothers were located and brought back to the farm. Raoult planned to use the science of selective breeding to create the perfect war horse for Germany. Before it was all said and done, he had seized 14 stud farms and acquired 3.9 million horses. He had Lipizaners and Arabians from Italy, Yugoslavia, and Austria, and would soon move them to Hasta, Czechoslovakia. Here is another photograph of Gustave Raoult with an Arabian horse. This is a picture of Wittes in Germany. You can see the white star on his head. He's a beautiful horse. Like I said, they thought he was one of the best fowls of the season. Dr. Rudolf Lessing. With Gustave's horse breeding program expanding, he needed an experienced, knowledgeable veterinarian to travel with him across Europe, attending sales and seizing the horses from state-owned stud farms. His partner would be Dr. Rudolf Lessing. Lessing grew up in Mecklenburg, a town known for horse farms. Although his father advised him not to, he joined Hitler Youth and later attended a veterinarian academy on behalf of the Nazi Party. His career began in Norway and then to Russia until he was recruited by Raoult. Throughout the years of his service, he began to realize the Nazis' true intentions, and his loyalty faded away from them. He only continued due to his loyalty to the horses. The Spanish Riding School. The Spanish Riding School is one of Austria's most loved institutions. The riding hall, painted entirely white, top to bottom, with a portrait of Charles VI, the school founder, on the wall. The architectural aspect blew visitors' minds. The ceiling, 17 feet high with no center beams to support it. This building was one of a kind back then. The riding hall was built in 1736, at this time being the largest structure in Vienna. The school dates back to 1580 during Habsburg Empire, a noble time when showcasing the equestrian arts was important. They still put on shows today with the beautiful white Lipizzaner stallions. Here are some pictures of the Spanish riding school today. It's magnificent, beautiful, and treasured. The first picture is the outside, like the front of the building. Here is the riding hall. As you can see, 17-foot tall ceilings, a chandelier in the middle, and there's 3 stories in that riding hall. The third picture is the stabling for the horses. They only provide the best. The Royal Lipizzaner. The Royal Lipizzaner comes from horses bred in Spain during the Renaissance. They bred European horses that were heavier boned with Arabian and Moorish breeds that were known for being swift and intelligent. The name originates from the village of Lipica, Italy. The horses from Lipica's stud farm were marked with their pedigree, requiring marking on both flanks, their right shoulder, and an L marked on their back hind. After the fall of the Habsburg Empire, the horses at the stud farm were divided, some staying and some being sent to Piber, Austria, and Yugoslavia. The horses from Piber supplied the Spanish riding school with the stallions, who were marked with a P. Gustave Raoult seized the Piber farm and decided to move these horses to a village of Hostau. The director of the Spanish riding school was shook. Lipizzaner characteristics. Lipizzaners are born black and their coat changes to gray throughout the years. Some of their coats do turn white, but most of them are gray. They take longer to mature. They have longevity. They are 14.2 hands to 15.2 hands tall, 58 inches to 62 inches, in other words. They're very strong. They have broad joints and small feet. They are known for being devoted to their caretaker. They have good memory and stamina. They also have dexterity. Dexterity is the ability to learn and perform tasks. The traits listed above made these horses suitable for military use. Raoult noticed this early on in his program. Alois Podhosky. Alois was the director of the Spanish riding school from 1939 to 1965 when he retired. In the early years of his career, he was kicked out of Austria's officer training due to a back injury and being unable to jump. After he was kicked out, he focused on the art of dressage, and 3 years later he would receive the Austrian highest cavalry honor. He would also serve in World War I and represent his country at the Olympics. In 1936, the Olympics in Berlin showcased the Nazi Party, and the equestrian events were only open to military members. Alois, the Austrian army officer, won the bronze medal with 2 German competitors above him in second and first. Equestrian art, perhaps more than any other, is closely related to the wisdom of life. Alois Podhosky. Here is a video of the Lipizzaners performing. In order to understand the value of these horses, I think it's important for you to see their performance.
Stud farm. Today, the Lipizzaner stallions that were once bred and trained for battle 400 years ago now perform equestrian ballet and dressage for audiences around the world. The horses show their grace and skill with choreographed trots, canters, and pirouettes. Early in the performance, steps, movements, and dressage are explained and demonstrated so the audience can recognize and better appreciate these movements as they appear in the performance. Dressage is the art of perfecting the natural gait. Essentially, it is the harmony between horse and rider. The goal is not only to entertain, but also to educate audiences with a focus on the historical background of the horses. In the airs above the ground section, the horses showcase maneuvers perfected by riders in battle. This is a series of exercises when the horse leaps above the ground. These include the cabriole, courbette, and lambade, and are performed with or without a rider. Following the airs above the ground act is a solo. This gives the audience a chance to focus their attention on one horse and rider. Throughout the show are many military drills. These acts further demonstrate the bond between rider and horse, as there is no obvious use of communication between the two. The grand finale of every performance is the grand quadrille. 6 to 8 horses and their riders perform an elaborate equestrian ballet. This performance demonstrates the long and patient training that culminates in a work of art. Traveling back in time when the horse was a symbol of grace and majesty, the Lipizzaner stallions are truly an experience not to be missed.
The hidden stud farm, Hostau. Gustave Raoult decided this was the best location to carry out his expanding breeding program. In 1942, the first Lipizzaner arrived at Hostau. Hostau is in the Sudetenland. This land was taken by Germany through the signing of the Munich Agreement. As we know, Hitler would later go against this policy and seize the whole Czechoslovakian nation. The stud farm has over 1,500 acres of pasture and adequate stabling, as the village has a long history involving horse farms. Germans thought this location would be the safest place to finish out the war. The Bohemian forest acted as a barrier between Germany to the west and Austria to the south, and they thought the likelihood of being attacked from the east or west was low. Colonel Hubert Rudowski. Herbert Rudowski was appointed to oversee the stud farm by Gustav Rau. Rudowski was an expert in equine breeding. He grew up with horses, learning to ride at the age of 10. At age 17, he enlisted in the Austrian cavalry, and when he came out, he was awarded a silver medal for courage. He was German-born, but felt he was Austrian due to his father working for an Austro-Hungarian emperor. When World War II came out, he was pulled to serve Germany. His brother passed away, and he watched over his nephew and niece. He would often go and get them to visit the horses at Hostau. His heart was with his family. By 1944, Hostau was full of mares and foals, the first of Rau's breeding program, all marked with the letter H. Checkpoint 1. Things to remember. The United States entered World War II in 1941. The Allied forces began bombing German-occupied Austria, and they had reached Vienna by 1942. This left Alois Podhosky very worried about the horses at the riding school. Buildings and civilians were being destroyed, and he was unsure of how long they could survive. By 1945, the Russian army was getting closer, and they were known for being brutal. They were also known to kill and eat horses because their armies were nearly starving. Armies closing in on Hostau. By April 1945, Russian and American forces are closing in on Czechoslovakia from the east and the west. Germany is falling in between the two. The USSR was advancing quite rapidly, and like I said before, they were known for being brutal. There are many stud farms for miles away that will soon be arriving at the stud farm for safekeeping. The stud farm is becoming overcrowded, feed is getting low, a war zone surrounds them, and on top of all of that, it is fowling season. They have a lot going on. The American forces are crossing the Rhine River around this time. While in Vienna, by 1943, Alois was able to move small shipments of horses to safe locations in Upper Austria due to the bombings that had reached Vienna. Alois Podhosky and his wife visited the farm at Hostau a few times throughout 1944 to see the mares that Rau seized from Piber. Podhosky insisted crossbreeding the horses would devalue them, and Rudowski had no choice but to follow Rau's order, so he didn't appreciate being pressed about the issue. That made their relationship sticky. By 1945, only 15 stallions remained at the Spanish riding school, including Alois's two personal mounts, Africa and Pluto. On March 6th, they were loaded up on train carts and sent to St. Martin. Along the way, they had troubles, including multiple air raids, causing great stress on horses and the men traveling along with them. Communication with Hostau had since been cut off, leaving Alois unsure of what was going on. Colonel Hank Reed. Hank Reed, a career soldier, was born in Richmond, Virginia, to a wealthy textile merchant. He was born on a hobby farm, so his love of horses came naturally. He was one of the best riders of his time. He was also part of the Army's horse show team and was an alternate in the 1932 Olympics. He graduated from West Point in 1922. He also was selected to join the Advanced Equestrian Course, a boot camp designed to shape the Army's future equestrian leaders. During this time, many people began to believe horses were not as efficient when it came to battles as mechanized tactics. Hank wanted to carry on the cavalry's traditions. At Fort Riley, located in Kansas, Hank was the operations officer of the 10th Cavalry, an all-African-American regiment. When they turned in their horses and got armor in return, the men would be placed into service jobs and the horses traded for tanks. January 1943, he was shipped to Fort Jackson and soon would become the commander of the 2nd Cavalry in a mission he never could have imagined. George S. Patton. Patton was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California, and later attended Virginia Military Institute and the United States Military Academy at West Point. In World War I, he served in the United States Tank Corps of the American Expeditionary Forces. Patton was secretly in England due to an operation in which his mission was to distract the German forces while Allied forces planned to invade Normandy. He would also be the one to lead American forces across the Rhine River, sending a message to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, "Today I pissed in the Rhine," in March 1945. Checkpoint 2. Making their way. Reed and his men are in England stationed at Camp Bootley. They are waiting for a visit from their commanding general, George Patton, in May 1944. At this point, none of the men, including Patton, had seen combat. The 2nd Cavalry had pushed their way into Germany, only being a few kilometers from Czechoslovakian border, and been a part of many battles by March 1945. The fall of Nazi German Empire is close, and the men can feel it. In April 1945, Reed and his troops settle in a Bavarian village of von Strauss in southern Germany. Operation Sauerkraut. Hank Reed receives a message that there is a Luftwaffe intelligence group fleeing Berlin, and that they had a crazy number of documents. He was told that they had ran out of gas and were hiding in a hunting lodge within the Bohemian forest. Reed ordered the capture of these men to be number 1 on his list. He summoned Captain Ferdinand Spurl to carry out this mission. Spurl was a prisoner of war interrogator. He was best for this mission because he spoke fluent German and was highly intelligent and sophisticated. The next day, April 26th, while he's finishing his plans to leave, a car with a white flag pulls into the lane. A German Luftwaffe officer got out of the car and demanded to speak to the commanding officer. He was escorted to the interrogation tent. Spurl asked the man for his name and rank, and he replied, "Oberst," meaning colonel, Walter H. Spurl was familiar with this tactic. Officers who wanted to negotiate would not give their last name. Walter H. kept saying that he wanted to speak to the commanding officer. Spurl takes his wallet. There's no ID, but he does find 2 photos of white horses. He explains that he had taken them at a stud farm in a nearby village of Hostau. He begins to explain the value of those horses. When asked if that's where he was stationed, he goes on to explain that he is a lover of horses and how he was a part of a meteorologist group that had been fleeing Berlin. Things click fast in Spurl's head, and he corrects Walter, telling him that he is a Luftwaffe intelligence group and knew that the group was hiding in a hunting lodge. He was surprised that Spurl knew. Walter tells Spurl that these were horses from the Spanish riding school seized by the Germans and moved there for safekeeping, but the forces were getting closer and closer. Spurl shows Reed the pictures, and he is blown away at the beauty of the horses. When he finds out that Walter H. belongs to the intelligence group, he attempts to make a deal. The deal was that they must surrender all members of the group along with all documents. In return, they would help find an escape route for the horses. Walter agrees that at dusk he and Spurl would head to Dynahof, where he will arrange the terms of the surrendering. When he arrived, there were 24 officers. They had one request, and that was to set the village on fire so it looked like they put up a fight rather than surrendered. Americans would return the next day. Luftwaffe officers had to dig the truckload of documents that they had buried on the property of the hunting lodge and prepare for their surrender. Back at the headquarters, Reed invited Walter to have dinner with him so they could talk about the horses more. Walter began to write a note giving instructions about how to contact him regarding a possible escape route for the Lipizaners. The note was addressed to Rudofsky, the director of the Hostau stud farm. He sent this note with his valet to a forester's house in the woods. Then that forester would take it to the stud farm at Hostau. Late April 1945. Late April 1945, Walter Halters visits the stud farm at Hastow, explaining that Rudofsky needs to consider asking the Americans to help them move the horses. The USSR was closing in. It was their best hope. He thought Walters could be there to test his loyalty to Germany, but he truly felt that he had good intentions. Alois Podhasky, his riders, and the remaining 15 stallions at the Spanish riding school fled to St. Martin in March, along with many other German refugees. And he knew that the Russians were getting closer. He could hear air raids. They were at great risk, and he was trying to figure out a plan to keep them safe. Letter of Promise. Rudofsky receives the letter from the forester, calls Lessing to his office, and presents him with it. After considering fleeing with the horses, he agreed with Halters that that would be the safest decision. Lessing was ordered to travel along the Czechoslovakia-German border with 2 horses. He was to meet Walter Halters at a forester's cabin in the woods. There they would talk about a possible escape route. Lessing went out to the stables and started to prepare immediately. Along with his thoroughbred horse Indigo, he brought along a white Lipizzaner stallion. Deep into the forest. Lessing knew that the risk he was taking was big. He would soon arrive at the forester's cabin. When he arrived and asked about the whereabouts of Walters, he was told that he had left, and the forester thought he had been captured by Americans. The forester warns Lessing that they were close, they have pushed into Germany, and they could be out patrolling. He offered his motorcycle to Lessing. He told him to leave the horses in the stable and to continue to search. Lessing knew that he needed to contact Halters. The fate of the horses depended on it. Lessing leaves the forester's cabin and continues his search. Not too long after he leaves, he is blocked by Americans holding machine guns. Hands up. Lessing shuts off the motor and explained that he was a local veterinarian. The American soldiers told him to walk ahead. There would be a jeep waiting for him. Lessing was nervous. He wasn't sure what would happen next. Possibly a prisoner of war camp. They take Lessing to Reed, and Reed explains that he is aware of the Lipizzaners in Hastow. Reed explains to Lessing that the staff at the stud farm needed to bring the horses to the Czechoslovakian border, and the Americans would ensure their safety after that. Although Lessing knew this was the answer to the problem, he explained the mares were about to foal and could not walk far. He also said that the director of the stud farm was willing to surrender, which Rudofsky had never said. Lessing lied, taking an even bigger risk. He requests that Reed sends an American officer to speak with him. Reed knew exactly who he was going to send. Reed would send an officer, but told Lessing that if he was not returned safely within 24 hours, they would advance into Hastow with guns blazing. Thomas Stewart. Thomas Stewart was born in Winchester, Tennessee. Stewart's father was elected to the state senate, and during World War II, everyone fought, privileged children included. He enlisted in 1941 at 27 years old, a little older than most. He was a Green Intelligence officer learning his new role. Under Reed's command of the newly mechanized cavalry group, there were 2 main units, the 2nd and the 42nd Squadron. On March 9, 1944, Reed received a letter that a group was shipping out to Liverpool. He handpicked Thomas Stewart to be one of the first men sent to Europe. Lessing and Stewart take off. Lessing and Stewart left at dusk on April 26th, walking back to where the American soldiers had stopped Lessing. They got on the motorcycle and headed back to the forester's home. It was dark by the time they reached it. They used a small light on the front of the motorcycle, needing to see but didn't want to attract any enemies. They hear an airplane overhead and Lessing shuts off the motor. Stewart tells Lessing, "Don't worry, that's Bed Check Charlie. He's one of ours." Lessing said, "That won't stop him from shooting us." And Thomas chuckled, as if it was a true statement. When they reached the horses in the forester's stable, Stewart approached the horses slowly, while Lessing explained that the Lipizzaner he was going to ride was one of King Peter's favorite mounts and came from a royal Yugoslavian stud farm. The path was dark and narrow, the moonlight was all they had. Early after they left the Lipizzaner, and Stuart tripped on a log, and Stuart was thrown to the ground. Thomas and the horse were fine. He smirked and climbed back on. Later on, they came across a brush pile blocking the road. As soon as Lessing was about to tell Stuart that the horse didn't jump, he was running past him, and before they knew it, he had landed the jump. So that's how you're supposed to do it, he said, very amused with himself. So some things that we need to consider. Rudofsky could decline the offer. Lessing lied and told the Americans that he was willing to surrender the stud farm. Rudofsky also could take Stuart as a prisoner of war because of his intelligence level. Hide the American. They reached Hastow at 2 a.m. on April 27th. When they arrived, Lessing takes him to his apartment. Wolfgang Kroll, the other farm's veterinarian, was waiting at the door. Wolfgang Kroll arrived at the stud farm 6 weeks ago with the White Russian refugees. Lessing's wife takes Stuart into the house to hide him and make him a hot cup of coffee. Wolfgang informs Lessing that although Rudofsky was in favor of the negotiation, General Schultz and a band of citizen soldiers had came to town and planned to set Hastow as their base. Though it was early in the morning, he put his horses in the stable. Then he went to talk to the stud farm director, Rudofsky. Rudofsky told him that his hands were tied and there was nothing he could do. He was not going to surrender. If they tried to negotiate with the Americans, Schultz would have them shot for treason. After a restless night of sleeping, Lessing goes to meet General Schultz in the morning. Before he could say anything, the general began screaming at him. "How dare you deceive the Germans? I'm going to have you shot. You must be crazy." Lessing stands his ground, saying that the men at Hastow's priority was to care for the horses. The war should have been won years ago, and he did not even care who won. Schultz reacts quite calmly and tells him that he must find the brigade commander for permission. But Thomas Stuart is now Schultz's prisoner of war. He will not go back. At first light on April 27th, Lessing, Wolfgang Kroll, and Thomas Stuart would leave on horseback to locate the brigade commander. They came upon a command post with 2 Nazi soldiers, a tense moment considering Thomas is an American. Rather than fleeing, he rode right up to the soldiers. Lessing told them that they had wished to speak to the brigade commander. They hesitated but told the General Major Weisenberg's headquarters was in Klattau, which was about 25 miles southeast. They know that they cannot get Stuart back in 24 hours. Kroll offers to go to the American base and tell them about the delay. Then he would go to the forester's house and wait for Lessing. Lessing and Stuart rode back to the stud farm to get Lessing's motorcycle and headed toward Klattau. When they arrived at Klattau, the general major was heated. Lessing tells him that the Americans' goal is to keep the horses safe and protect the human life at Hastow. He yells at Lessing, "You should have never acted independently and crossed over enemy lines," and tells him the war is not over. Lessing is pretty pissed at this point, and he replies, "Oh really, the war is not over? Berlin stays German. Vienna will be German again." "That's what you hear on the radio, but is that what you believe?" "Okay, fine, do what you want," General Major Weisenberger told him. Lessing was lucky. He could have been shot or thrown into a prison camp. Lessing insisted that he write a letter stating the agreement. Heading back to the Forester's lodge, they came across the same soldiers but told them to move aside. They had a letter from the general now. At this point, they would part ways, Thomas heading back to base and Lessing waiting for Kroll to return. Wolfgang Kroll was being held by Colonel Reed. Thomas waiting for Thomas's arrival. Wolfgang Kroll had arrived just in time. as the Americans were preparing a task force to go save Thomas. Lessing waited for Kroll for hours at the Foresters' home. Lessing had not slept in over 30 hours and decided to head back to the stud farm. Here is a picture of Dr. Lessing and Dr. Kroll working together in the hostile stud farm. This is the note that the brigade commander sent with Lessing to give to General Schultz. Her General Schultz, I have taken it as my duty to allow the veterinary officer and the American captain to cross over enemy lines. However, the negotiation of Hastao Stud Farm cannot be determined by me and will thus require these men to return to Hastao. The Americans needed permission to. Patton, Hank Reed's buddy and mentor. Patton had given Reed the go-ahead through the Jeep radio, but also told him that if he decided to risk his men's life to rescue a horse, it was on him. Reed would say that his cavalrymen were confused and lost behind enemy lines if the mission failed. Patton would also take no public responsibility if it failed. When Reed radioed him and asked for permission after negotiations were made, he replied, "Get them and make it fast." On the morning of April 28th, Reed split his task force into 3 units, A, F, and C. Meanwhile, in Hastao, Rudowski was hearing bombings in the distance. A few explosions had gone off in the field, spooking the horses. General Schultz was not quite able to control the troops. He became very mad and he left. American troops would arrive later on the same day. Thomas Stewart had orders to secure the perimeters, and on the 29th, Hank Reed would arrive to tour the stud farm. He was very pleased with all the horses, and he would assign a small task force of platoon soldiers to protect the stud farm. This is a breakdown of Task Force Reed. Troop A was commanded by Thomas Stewart. They were approaching Hastao from the north, crossing Wesselschultz. It was a convoy of tanks, armored cars, and jeeps. When they entered Czechoslovakia, they faced a brief gunfire but continued on to Hastao with no problems. Troop F was led by Captain Donald Quinlivan, and they were approaching Hastao from the east. They were following the same route that Stewart and Lessing had taken. They were the first troop to arrive at Hastao. Troop A would arrive a few hours later. Troop C was led by Robert McCaleb, and their responsibility was searching for large groups of prisoners of war in the area. April 30th, 1945. On the morning of April 30th, Hank Reed was in Schwarzenfeld, which was about 80 kilometers southwest of the stud farm, receiving 2 awards: the French Legion of Honor and the Croix de Guerre. Stewart was now in charge of the stud farm, and he received a radio call that there was a roadblock that had been built overnight, blocking their path back into Germany. Stewart orders men to go to Rosendorf, a small town close by. Then they come across another roadblock assisted with German gunfire. They wipe them out, continue, and set their eyes on a small house. Raymond Mans, only 19 years old, advanced toward the house and was killed, hit in the shoulder, and the second shot hit him in the head. Although he lost his life, he was able to provide cover for the rest of his platoon. Around the same time, Stewart got notification from the troop in Rosendorf that Germans were coming toward them. He drafted some of the released prisoners of war. The battle lasted for 5 hours. The Germans went back into the woods, later coming out with white flags. Stewart and Quinlivan defeated the last bits of the German resistance. Today was also the day that Nazi leader Adolf Hitler would commit suicide. Meanwhile, in St. Martin, Alois is still at St. Martin, and communication has not reached him in weeks. He had no idea that the Americans had planned to save the Lippes honors, and he had been worried. He was appointed to defend St. Martin. He received a letter with "most secret" written across the front. He wanted to surrender peacefully, and many of the Germans felt that they had a chance of winning still. The mayor of the town came to Podhasky asking for him to gather up the Volkstern troops to fight the Americans. This is exactly what he did not want. Instead, he came up with a plan to distract the mayor. The mayor owned a butcher shop, and Podhosky orders the soldiers to post up outside of local shops to prevent looting. Next, two local bullies approached Podhosky. They were Nazi Party officials. They said that the Chrysler had ordered to block all roads leading to the town, and he would soon be arriving. Podhosky decided that that was not a good idea. It would block in fleeing soldiers of their own. A half hour later, the Chrysler arrives, and he's angry that his orders were not carried out. Podhosky remained calm and told him that it would hinder their soldiers, and he did not think it was necessary, but just in case the Volkstrom had barriers ready. Chrysler replied that everything was in good order. He left in a shiny black car. By noon the next day, a rider coming into town warned everyone that the Americans were close. Podhosky and his men changed out of their uniforms, handed in their weapons, and hid in the stalls. When they arrived, they gathered Germans still in uniforms and released prisoners of war. By the end of the day, the Americans had taken control and things were calm. The American Brigade General William A. Collar of the 20th Corps arrived and set up headquarters at the Arco Castle in St. Martin. On the 7th of May, Podhosky was worried about the horses. Thankfully, the ones with him were safe, but what about the others? He was out in the stables when one of his riders approached him, telling him that the American officer was requesting him. This American officer saw him ride in the Olympics. General Walton Walker. He told Podhosky that his boss, George S. Patton, was coming to St. Martin and would love to see the horses. He was thrilled and began to prepare. Could he be someone who could help save the horses? He was worried. The horses had not had proper training in weeks. He wondered how they would perform. Patton's visit was delayed for a few days. This eased Podhosky's mind a bit because they had extra time to practice. When Patton arrived, Podhosky knew this was going to be the most important performance of his life. Throughout the show, Patton and his peers began to become more and more engaged. By the end of the show, they were blown away. After the show, when they had a chance to talk, Podhosky explains to Patton the value of the horses and begins to ask Patton to help save the Spanish riding school. Patton begins to whisper to his colleagues. Then he turns back to Podhosky and says the horses were now the American Army's protection. This is a photo of Alois Podhosky mounted on his horse Africa, performing the finale for General Patton. Once again, here is Patton on the left side and Alois on the right. This photo is General Patton, Colonel Podhosky, and Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson touring the stables in St. Martin, Austria. The caravan. On the 15th of May, the American troops that had been occupying Hastao were preparing to leave the stud farm with over 300 horses, many of them already with fowls by their side and more mares close to their due date. Reed gave the task of preparing the trucks to Quinlivan. He used his sharp mind and tactical skills building ramps to load the horses and high sidewalls for flatbed trucks. They loaded the mares closest to fowling and the newborns onto the trucks. They were headed to Kolsting, Germany, a small town located at the border. Reed had ordered Wolfgang Kroll to go and ensure stability for them, adequate stabling and pasture. Although it would only be enough for a few weeks, it would have to do. When everything was ready, Thomas Stewart got into his jeep and led the way. They knew that there was a Czechoslovakian checkpoint, and when they approached it, the guards were giving them grief. They were shouting at them, saying that those horses cannot go through. When Quinlivan saw the second group of horses and men approaching, he told the guard that if he did not open it, he would open it for them. The guards then opened the gate. When the gate opened, everyone went through, Lessing, Stewart, and Quinlivan. But Rudofsky turned and went back to Hostow, where his family was. They could not bear to leave them. Lessing called him naive when trying to convince him to come along. When they arrived at Coldstream on May 16th, they were all tired and footsore, and the stables were nothing like they were used to. Now that the horses were under American Army protection, they had a new worry. How are they going to feed them and keep them safe from thieves? Here is a picture of the convoy leaving Hastow. You can see the raised side bars that they had built to keep the horses in. Quite a thing to see. A photo of American troops and German grooms watching the horses being loaded. Alois takes a trip. Alois is flying for the first time in his life. He is headed to the 2nd Cavalry. When he arrives at the Skoda Castle, he is nervous as expected. He was led to a bedroom and told to make himself comfortable. At 6 p.m., he would have dinner with Reed. They talked horses, Reed telling Alois that at Fort Riley there was a soldier who had named his horse Podhorsky after seeing him in the 1936 Olympics. Reed explained what had happened over the last few weeks, filling him in about the horses. He told them that he was having them taken to Coldstream, about 45 miles away, but the conditions were still very dangerous and the horses needed to be turned to Austria. Alois told him that not all the horses at Hostow was his. Some were from Italy and Yugoslavia. The following morning, they left in Hank Reed's Jeep. On the way, Hank explained to Alois the housing was only temporary. When they arrived, Lessing was there to greet them, all three of them toward the stables. They decided that the horses will be moved to St. Martin and Alois would fly back in the American colonel's plane and start finding houses for the horses. He would take back 219 Austrian mares, 40 Lipizaners that did not come from the Spanish riding school, agreeing he would look over them until they could be returned to their homelands in which they belonged. On May 22nd, American troops would load the horses back into the trucks and take them to St. Martin. The group of horses from Yanal-Pulaski would remain with the 2nd Cavalry, including Wates. The horses were restless and ready to get out of the trucks. When they arrived later that night, they realized that they had forgotten the ramp to unload the horses in Coldstream. When unloading the horses, they had to jump off the truck beds. Unfortunately, the only horse lost on this mission was the mare who jumped off the ramp, broke her leg, and had to be shot. The war is over. The Second World War came to an end in Europe on May 8, 1945. Germany was filled with horses that were seized or left by fleeing civilians. Not only did the Americans have the responsibility of establishing a new government and processing prisoners of war, but they also had to figure out where they were going to feed their horses and find adequate stabling. On June 16th, 17th, Reed, Stewart, and Rudofsky were called to the 3rd Army headquarters. They were there to testify that none of the original bloodline horses remained, the bloodline that was there before Raoul arrived. Many of them were sent out to be war horses when they turned 4. Rudofsky swore that the horses' pedigrees were accurate and that none of them belonging to Czechoslovakia, concluding the capture of the horses was lawful and the purebred horses could be claimed as spoils of war. Now that the horses were property of the U.S. Army, they needed to appoint a new Chief of Army Remount Service. In August, Colonel Fred Hamilton was appointed for the position. He was a horse lover himself, and this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Colonel Hamilton reports to Europe. On August 21, 1945, Colonel Hamilton receives orders to report to Europe. His mission was to inspect all the horses and facilities that had been captured. Hamilton would set out on his mission. The first farm he would visit would be located in Monsbach. Lessing and Quinlivan were stationed there. Hamilton was impressed at first sight of the horses. He decided that the best of the horses should be shipped to America for the remount program. Lessing wanted a future where people could ride their horses again, whether it for pleasure or sport. He supported Hamilton's decision, although it was a tough thing to do. They would never survive the post-war over in Europe, as it was in rough shape and lacked food and shelter for the horses. The horse detectives. As the summer came to an end, men were beginning to depart. Thomas Stewart would head back to America with the Bronze Medal for Bravery on September 1st, 1945. Lieutenant Quinlivan was the only remaining member of the 2nd Cavalry in Germany. Quinlivan received top-notch secrets from the War Department on September 19th. Colonel Fred Hamilton had selected him to join a special group. This group would be known as the Horse Detectives. This group would have the mission to select the best of the horses and ship them to America. Cavalry officers, veterinarians, and a horse trainer made the group of 6 men. Over the next 3 weeks, they would evaluate the personality, composure, and pedigree of the horses. Germans were known to hide their best stock, so they often had to search. By the end of the month, they had selected 150 horses, including Wattez. Reed made a final visit to Mansbach to see the horses, knowing that they would leave soon. He wrote a letter of recommendation for Lessing. He also invited Lessing and Wolfgang Kroll to come back to America since they were so loyal and had done such skilled work. Kroll and Lessing prepared a leather-bound photo album of horses he had saved. Lessing decided to stay when he learned that his family could not go along with him. Kroll was single and took Reed up on the offer. This is a picture of the leather-bound photo album that was gifted to Charles Reed. Across the top it says, "Oh, luck of the world on the back of horses." And this is a picture of a Lipizzaner stallion. Heading to their new home. Wolfgang Kroll, Quinlivan, and the horses would travel by train to a German port. From there they would go across the Atlantic. Lessing would return home. While on the train ride, one morning they opened the boxcar and Gospa, one of the mares, had foaled. This foal was special as it was the first of Wattez's offspring to grow up in America. When they arrived at Bremerhaven, Germany, they loaded all the horses into wooden crates and hoisted them up into the air onto the ship. The Liberty ship Stephen F. Austin would carry over 60 men and now 151 horses. The crew had built individual box stalls for the stallions. Mares placed in standing stalls, and the fowls were gathered and placed together. The departure of the horses on October 12, 1945 was very bittersweet for Lessing. 5 days into the trip across the Atlantic, they entered the Bay of Biscay and sailed into a terrible storm. When the ship began to buck and toss, hell broke loose. The horses began to lose their balance. The men tried to comfort them, but they began to pull on their restraints by yanking up their heads. The storm continued to get worse, the horses eventually busting out of their single crates. The lights were blown out, the horses were going crazy, the men could hear hoofs clanging against metal and bone-chilling whinnies. The men went down and got them separated, because if they didn't, they would have been killed. In good faith, everyone was alive, although they were covered in cuts and blood. It took hours to get them sewed back up, but the seas were finally calm. Due to the storm, the ship's captain had to take a detour, and now they were thrown off course. The crossing was originally supposed to take 10 to 12 days, and now it was expected to be over 2 weeks. When the horses arrived, they were not in the best of shape. They ran out of food 2 days before arriving. Food for the horses was extremely limited at the time. They had only enough hay and grain on the ship for the planned time frame. On October 28, 1945, 16 days after leaving Germany, the ship arrived in Newport News, Virginia. When Hamilton boarded the ship to inspect the new horses for the remount program, he asked Quinlivan how many they had lost. Quinlivan was super proud. They had lost none and gained 2. 2 days before arriving in America, another mare had foaled. This map is showing their trip across the Atlantic from Bremerhaven, Germany, through the Bay of Biscay to Newport News City, Virginia. Will I ever ride again? On December 9th, 1945, George Patton was in a car accident in the Rhineland. After this, he would be paralyzed from the neck down. When his doctor came to talk to him, the first thing he asked was if he would ever be able to ride again. This was months after saving the horses at Hastau. The horses were now settled in Virginia. December 21st, 1945, Patton passed away due to a pulmonary embolism. His wife said his last wishes were to be buried next to his men at the 3rd Army Cemetery in Luxembourg. At this time, Reed was stationed at Fort Myers, where he received his final service. George Patton had passed away, and he was to report to Luxembourg to perform in Patton's honor. He ensured that every detail was perfect, having the men practice all night. As Patton's coffin came down the road, there was a horse that followed. A black horse wearing his saddle and in his stirrups sat the general high boots, with the toes facing backwards. This symbolized a tragic loss. This tradition dates back to Genghis Khan. Throughout 1946 and 47. On April 7th, 1946, the horses would lead a parade at the Alisher Army Remount Depot in Front Royal, Virginia. Crowds of people came to see the victory parade. At 2 p.m., the horses began the parade. The horse experts in the crowd were pleased with what they saw. The last horse that was let out was Witez. The final event was a driving display of 4 Lipizzaner mares decked out in brass-studded imperial harnesses pulling a stagecoach. After the parade, reporters and photographers from all over came to snap pictures and interviews. There were also people looking to purchase horses, but none of them were for sale. After spending the last year with Witez, Quinlivan will be shipped to a new assignment in Fort Robinson, and the horse will be shipped to the Pomona Remount Department in California. Pomona Remount Department was the former home of W.K. Kellogg, a well-known Arabian breeder. When he bought it in 1925, he paid $25,000 for 377 acres. In 1932, he donated the ranch, $600,000, and 88 purebred Arabians to the University of California so they could find an institute of animal husbandry. A year had passed since Alois and the horses fled the riding school. Conditions were still not suitable for their return. By April 1946, he had found an empty riding hall in Wels, Austria. Although it was in rough shape, it was perfect for the horses. For now, anyway. Throughout 1947, European countries claimed their horses were seized unlawfully, and the State Department did not want any trouble and recommended that they be returned. The Senate Armed Service Committee began holding hearings. A group of them went to inspect the horses. Tom Stewart's father, the Senator of Tennessee, included. Some of the horses were already loaded up in New Orleans when the Senate blocked the release of the horses and ruled them legitimate spoils of war. The auction. By 1948, Fred Hamilton had sent 216 horses to America in 2 separate shipments, the first in 1945 and the second the following year. At this time, the remount service was quickly dwindling, and he was forced to auction off most of his horses. The American Jockey Club would not register them. Only 4 out of the whole herd was registered. The last time they would all get together would be at the 1948 London Olympics. The remaining horses were transferred to the Department of Agriculture, and they decided that they did not have the funds to budget the horse breeding operations. By fall, all the horses at Kellogg's farm had been auctioned off, including Witez. He was settled into a train and sent to Fort Reno, Oklahoma. When he arrived, he would see a familiar face, Thomas Stewart. He was in no position to buy him, but wanted a final farewell. Earl Herbert was a rancher who had been on the search for Wotez since he left Kellogg's farm. A single white rose. Alois arrived in New York on his first transatlantic flight in late September 1950. A few days later, on October 3rd, the famous Lipizaners were docked. News, local people, reporters, and photographers gathered to capture this moment. Along with 12 other Lipizaners, Podhosky's personal mounts unloaded out of the ship. He was happy to see that they arrived in good condition. Kenilworth Riding School was where they would be taken. This school is in Westchester County. Here they would prepare for their big performance. People from all around came to watch these horses practice. They were a hot topic. Ever since the horses moved to Wells 1946, Podhosky had been working hard to gain fans for the horses. He not only took his shows to Switzerland and Italy, but he also performed at the London Olympics. Podhosky and the Lipizaners performed on November 7th after 4 weeks of preparation. He was the guest of honor at the National Horseball Show at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a very elegant establishment in Madison Square Garden. At the end of the performance, the announcer came onto the speaker and said that there was a special guest that had came to see the performance. Podhosky rides his horse to the center of the arena. Meeting him in the middle is an older lady, Beau Patton, presenting him with a single red rose. Alois Podhosky tells her, "I am very happy to be able to show you the horses that General Patton, a great American soldier, saved for Austria." This is a photo of Alois Podhosky receiving his single rose. Wotez's birthday. January 3rd, 1965, at Calabria Ranch, Calabasas, California. Wotez's fans gathered around him to celebrate his birthday. They served him a carrot cake as a treat and hung a flag over his stall. At 27 years old, he was healthy as ever, with a shiny coat and a playful personality. I decided to follow the story of Wotez because he was a true refugee. He would never return to his homeland. This horse was a year-old colt when the Second World War started and had been through so much. This horse meant everything to the men who fought so hard to protect the horses throughout the ending days of the war. To me, Wotez truly lived up to his name. Warrior, chieftain, knight. After the war, Wolfgang Kroll. After he assisted the arrival of the Lipizaners to America, he returned to Germany where he worked for a circus. He would return to America and work at a San Diego zoo, then to Chicago as an inspector at a meat packing plant. Rudolph Lessing. Lessing would return to Hastow and continue working as a veterinarian. Becoming very good friends with Quinlivan, he would visit America so they could reunite. He would later be given a Medal of Honor by the Austrian government. William Donald Quinlivan. After Quinlivan was discharged in 1949, he moved to Los Angeles with his wife Rita. He passed away in 1985. He was known to adopt unwanted animals, including birds and a Shetland pony. In 1991, his daughter, a nurse and an Army major, was honored at a Lipizzana performance in Nebraska. Gustave Raoult. After World War II, Gustave was the most influential horseman in Germany. He was given the credit of rebuilding the breeding program after both World Wars. Germany named their highest equestrian honor after him, along with a street. He passed away in 1954. Hubert Rudofsky. In 1945, Hubert Rudofsky went to a resettlement camp where he spent 18 months. When he ran into Lessing at an equestrian event, He told them that he regretted not going to America, where his family had already moved. He would die in his sleep the night the recognition at the Spanish riding school was aired on TV for him. After the war continued, Ferdinand Spurl. After the war, he moved to Illinois, where he would work as a hotel keeper at Pierre Marquette Hotel. For the 50th anniversary of the Lipizzaner rescue, he returned to Kolzerg, where two girls recognized him. They remembered him being the one who saved them as they were fleeing from Czechoslovakia with their teacher in 1945. Thomas Stewart. Stewart returned home and later met his wife Annie. They had 3 children together. Stewart was one of the last ones to pass away, after being honored at the Spanish Riding School, along with receiving the National Gold Award by Austria for the role he played in World War II. Stewart passed away in 2006 at 96 years old. Witez. A few months after Witez's 27th birthday, he passed away asleep in the pasture. The sign from the Times at Mansburg Stud Farm that reads Witez Field Headquarters is located at the International Museum of the Horse in Lexington. Hastow. The stud farm at Hastow, now called Houston, no longer exists. The place Rudolphsky once called home is now a juvenile delinquent center. The Spanish Riding School. The Spanish Riding School of Vienna still performs today and still considered one of Austria's most loved institutions. Here is another picture of the Hastow stud farm. This last picture is the American troops leading the horses to coltsting. You can see all the trucks following them with the raised sidewalls, all the horses. A great picture. I just wanted to thank everybody for viewing my presentation. This was a really interesting mission to dig into. I'm so glad that I picked this topic. There was a lot that I learned, and most importantly, I think that this mission proved that people are able to come together and make a change for something that they believe in or something that they care about. Once again, thank you.